Thurgood Marshall, without a doubt, was one of the most significant, in my opinion, and I'm not a lawyer, transformational legal minds of the 20th century. Was tutored by a great mind and a great person, Charles Hamilton Houston. And it is my understanding that they started, in a sense, working on Brown versus Board of Education 20 years before that came to, 19 years before that became a reality. The legal foundation was laid in case after case after case, steady and steady and steady. Some people say they don't know when Thurgood Marshall slept, because when they got to his office, no matter how early he was there and no matter how late they left, he was still there. I heard him speak first at the Wheat Street Baptist Church, Atlanta, Georgia, in a civil rights rally. And he was introduced by the pastor of Wheat Street, who baptized my wife, Edwina. He was introduced that night as Mr. Civil Rights. And he talked really about the contradictions in the American system of justice, as well as the progress we had made and how far we had to go. One example he gave was a gentleman named Eugene Talmadge, who was at one time governor of Georgia, who said before he would allow a train to come to Georgia with blacks and whites sitting in the same car, he would turn the train around and send it back up the railroad. And Thurgood Marshall said, and just the other day, his son rode a train into Georgia, seated in a car with black people and white people sharing the same facility. I think the second time I heard him speak was on a Baptist convention in St. Louis, 1961. And the third time was during the Lyndon Johnson conference to fulfill these rights. That was an exciting time. I was listening to Thurgood and looking at Edwina because we were engaged to be married, and this was around.
Not necessarily in that order. I get it.
Yes. This must have been around April or May of 1966, and we were married in July. And that night, he gave a kind of overview of civil rights history and talked about what it was like to come onto the stage following Lyndon Johnson. The other thing I would say about him, and one of my friends of many years, Andy Young, been friend of our family for many years, says that all great leaders have a great sense of humor. And Thurgood Marshall certainly had a great sense of humor, even in serious and dangerous situations. That has been brought out in the more recent presentation of Thurgood Marshall when he was in the hospital and Nixon wanted to know what his condition was and asked for his hospital record. And the story goes that Thurgood Marshall said, yes, send them to them, but bring them to me first. which he simply wrote on the back of the envelope, "Not yet." Damon Keith has an interesting story in his autobiography when Thurgood Marshall was celebrating his 80th birthday, and they looked at the list and they said, well, there's some people who ought to be on this list, and they're not on there, and we're sure that this is an oversight. And Judge Keith called Vernon Judd, and Vernon Judd said, I'm not going to call him. You call him. And Judge Keith said, well, I'm not going to call him. I will call Wiley Branton, the late Wiley Branton. Wiley Branton said, well, I know where he is. I'll call him. And he did, and said, well, we've been looking at the list, and we think that probably some folk you have forgotten. He said, hell, it's my birthday. I know who I want there, bam. And hung up the phone. It's amazing that he could go through the dangers, the toils, the snares that he went through, maintain his sanity and his brilliance, and in the language of our elders, keep on keeping on.
When the U.S. Supreme Court handed down the 1954 Brown decision mandating the desegregation of America's public schools, it was a major victory for civil rights attorney Thurgood Marshall. But no one, not even the justices, knew what would happen in the South.
I just know that many people were disappointed with the follow-up to the 54 decision, where the court entered the language of "with all deliberate speed," which seemed to have been winning the game with a 9-0 stroke, and then coming back and retarding the progress. And it's possible that that slowness gave the opposition time to mount what one, I think, Southern governor said would be a 50-year struggle against the implementation of Brown, and in that 50-year process, they would nullify it and interpose it. And to some extent, not to some extent, but to a large extent, that is what they were able to do. Not totally, but to a large degree. I understand that Daddy King had prayer with Governor Wallace. Jesse Jackson told me about an individual he met in Texas when he was campaigning for the nomination of the Democratic nomination of the presidency. And a gentleman in Texas came up and asked if he could have a photograph made with him. And Jesse Jackson had just finished speaking about Selma and the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And Jesse said, yes, you can have a photograph made with me. And he said to the gentleman who had requested the photograph, that was a great moment in Selma. And the gentleman said, yes, I was there. He said, that was really a great moment, wasn't it? He said, you don't know under what condition I was there. I was a member of the Klan. And Jesse paused for a moment, and he looked at Jesse with tears in his eyes and said, but this time, I want to be on the right side. Would you permit me this photograph to show to my children and grandchildren? You really want to know?
Yeah.
The Brooklyn Dodgers.
That's an easy one.
Yeah, you know, see Jackie Robinson hit that ball. This new era, this revolution, everybody I came in contact with in those young childhood days, everybody was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan, a Jackie Robinson fan. My civics teacher in the 8th grade brought her radio to school, to class, turned it on, and allowed us to listen to the World Series, and then interpreted the meaning of the desegregation of Major League Baseball. Now, that was not in the book, but it was in life and in history. She was very, very creative.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce one of the courageous, one of the beautiful sisters of the movement. I met Dorothy Carden many, many years ago when we both were much younger. She was working with SCLC, working with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., teaching people how to pass the so-called literacy test. Dorothy Carden.
And I know I told you much more than you asked me, but...
Any other questions?
But I can sum up from Goldsboro to Raleigh, then still in North Carolina, to Petersburg, Virginia, and then to moving to Atlanta, and then and moving up to Ithaca. I don't know which place is home. There. Anywhere I hang my hat is home. Anybody like the blues? But,
Okay. I just gotta, that was great.
I'm such a ham.
Well, it's great. I watched the Actors Studio, and he was doing an interview with Robin Williams.
Yeah.
And he never got a question in. I'm sensing this is where this is going, baby.
Yeah, you have to watch me.
So,
Yeah.
So if in fact that's okay.
You can put your hand up and I'll get the message.
No.
Go back to the question.
We're here to learn about you.
I'm the education director, but guess what? When they needed a coffee, Dorothy, could you? Well, we need somebody to take minutes, like women, like they can't write. And now, see, but the women's movement hadn't happened then. I'm talking about before the 70s when the women's movement happened. So when now I would say, Martin, let me show you. Now here's the way you make coffee. You put some coffee in, and then you push this button or plug it in or whatever you think that I would say that. But actually, it was a man, never forget Jack Odell on our staff, who said, Dr. King, Dorothy needs to stay in here, be a part of this discussion, because we're talking about, well, let's say we're talking about how we're going to go into Birmingham and respond to Reverend Shuttlesworth's invitation to come over to Birmingham. But the beginning of the Citizenship Education Program, which is a program I really want people to know about, and this is why I emphasize we didn't just march. Nobody, and I don't care if the governor did stand there saying, you segregation now, segregation forever. But nobody can take away your privileges, and here the Supreme Law says that. A little bit here, but yeah, you have a right peaceably to assemble. Translated, that meant, we jolly well can march from Selma to Montgomery. Now, see, I already have a master's degree from Boston University, but I learned more about civics, as we used to call it, helping these people understand and put your flesh and blood, as they say, meat on the bones of these documents on which the country was founded. You have a right peaceably to assemble. The violence was real, but so was the joy in realizing that we were at last doing something to change a really sorry state of affairs in the country. A sentence that I like to repeat a lot is that if things are going to change, we have to change it. You know, it was... You read the letter from a Birmingham jail, and the ministers who wrote a letter complaining about our being in Birmingham. They talked about, as many people did, wait, cool off. And, somebody said, this wasn't Dr. King, said, if we wait any longer, we'll be in a deep freeze. And how much longer do we have to wait for very, very basic rights?
How much did the songs of the movement become part of your citizenship?
They were incredibly important because, I don't know, do black folk, do we just sing all the time, y'all? We pretty much, in the churches, anybody anybody can, in some of the churches in the South, I don't know if y'all sing in your church, but I used to go to church, people just could strike up a song, or if somebody started a song, somebody else would jump in and help them out. What the Spirit says to everybody. What the Spirit says do, I'm going to do, oh Lord, I'm going to do what the Spirit says. Okay, let's do it. I'm going to do what the Spirit says to do. I'm going to do what the Spirit says to do. Oh, what the Spirit says to do, I'm going to do, oh Lord. I'm going to do what the Spirit says. Oh, we got a voter registration drive. I don't know if you asked me about the songs, but the songs came out of, as I said, the sorrow songs, the songs of hope, the songs of celebration. Out of every mood, there were songs. I don't know if we would have had a civil rights struggle movement had it not been for the singing. When we talk about organizing a nonviolent campaign, there are very specific steps that I use, and a lot of people, us who work together, use this pattern. But it's about college students say, well, what do we do about whatever? I said, well, what do you want to do? Okay, they have no answer. Okay, you want to organize a campaign? Let me tell you how you organize it. First, you get the facts. But the last step in a nonviolent campaign is always reconciliation. That is the goal. It's what Martin Luther King said. It's what Martin Luther King said. It's what Jesus said. It's what Buddha said. It's what all the great spiritual teachers in the universe. The idea is to learn how to flow together. We don't even know how to have dialogue. But anyway, 6 steps on a nonviolent campaign. Maybe we can do a workshop on that.
Ladies and gentlemen, Broken Cotton.
Come by here, my Lord.
I don't know if we would have had a movement had we not sung together.
Come by here.
We sang from the many moods and experiences that we were going through. We actually could tell the whole story of that great struggle that rearranged the social order in this country. We could tell the whole story through its music.
And one day, Wyatt T. Walker, who was the executive director of SCLC, coming in and out of the office, he asked me if I would go to work for them. And I said, of course. It was a little bit more money, so I was glad to do that. Plus, I was really carried away with Martin Luther King Jr. To digress a little, when I first went back to Atlanta, I went to a mass meeting. That's when I first saw Otis. A girlfriend asked me to go to a meeting. She said, Martin Luther King Jr. is speaking. And I said, oh, I want to see Dr. King. And I went to the meeting. The students were having a very difficult time because they were upset over some of the agreements that the elders had made. And they were almost out of control, and they couldn't get them to calm down. And one young man stepped out and spoke to the group, and they calmed down, and that was Otis Moss, Jr. And I asked my girlfriend at that time, who is he? And she told me, she said, oh, that's Otis Moss. Don't you know Otis Moss? And I said, no, I never heard of him. But shortly after that, Martin Luther King came in, and he spoke to the crowd, and he was able to calm the crowd. And I said, you know, something is going on here that's very different, and I would like to be a part of it. Hard to describe a person when they walk in the room, you are so excited and carried away with their presence that you just want to sit and listen to them all the time. He was very funny, had a tremendous sense of humor. He was very fair. When things went wrong in the office, a lot of times Wyatt was a person that made very tough decisions, but Dr. King, people could go to him and appeal to him, and he was always a person who'd listen. I can recall the time when they were struggling with whether or not to march in Birmingham, Alabama. And because all of these kids could be arrested, and there were a lot of young kids participating. And they had a meeting, and Dr. King sat and he listened to all the students, he listened to all of the staff, he listened to everyone, and he knew that he could be arrested should he go out. And he went out of the room, and we all said, oh my goodness, he's gone out to pray and talk to the Lord. When he comes back, we know what's going on. And sure enough, when he went out and he came back, he put his coat on. He said, we're going. I cannot sit and allow them to control our behavior. He didn't operate on his own all the time. He did on his own, but he also took advice from others. He would talk with people, Wyatt Rustin, Andy Young, Wyatt Walker, Ralph Abernathy. He would consult with everybody before he made a final decision. Oh, Stan Levison. Stan Levison was one person that Dr. King depended on completely. He didn't make a move without Stan. Was very, very committed financially to Martin Luther King. He lived in New York. He was a very wealthy man. He is the one that really brought in Wyatt Rustin and many of the other attorneys, Bill Kunstler, and all of those who were from the legal perspective, but he also raised a lot of money for the organization. He had contact with Harry Belafonte. Many of the people who were the large donors, and mainly the Jewish community. The Jewish community was very supportive of the civil rights movement.
What was Dr. King's reaction when he was assassinated?
Everyone was devastated. And it reminded Dr. King of really the things that had occurred, that happened with him when he lived in Alabama, because they had to face the possibility that he was going to be assassinated even before he moved to Atlanta for the SCLC.
Did he get a sense of his own stature at that point? This is 60 to 66.
You know, I think he did. Early on, he always played himself down, and other people were constantly telling him how great he was. But he realized, I think later on, that he was having a tremendous impact on this nation, and it was really a burden for him. And many times he often wondered why he had been chosen to do it, because threats were coming from everywhere. And many times the FBI, they came to me trying to track and find out where he was, and I wouldn't tell them. And being young and inexperienced, I challenged them. It's a wonder they didn't take me and put me in jail.
I mean, during that time period, he had this I have a dream speech. Did he get a sense of that once he gave it? Did he come back and say, boy, did I nail that one?
Oh, no, that wasn't Dr. King. No, he always questioned himself whether or not he had done the right thing or how he could have done it differently. He was not a person who was cocky. He was not a person who felt that he nailed it, as you said. Even preaching a sermon, it was always that he could have done it a little better. It was just like he always felt he never really measured up to what God had intended him to be.
1968, Dr. King's assassinated. Where were you when you got the news?
I was in Cincinnati, Ohio, sitting at the kitchen table when Huntley Brinkley came on and made the announcement. It was devastating. The children were sitting at the table. I think we were about to have dinner at that time when it came over. And shortly after that, you got a call that it had occurred, but we already knew because we had heard it on the news. The blood had drained out of my body. I felt like I couldn't do anything after that. And I was frightened because I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know how the community would respond, whether or not there would be riots all over the country, and there were in many places. But it's hard. I can't even recall it because you get numb. Everybody was concerned of what is going to happen now that they've killed Kennedy. And then it happens to Dr. King. You just wonder whether or not all you're doing and what you've done and what you've sacrificed, whether or not it's worth it all. I think Dr. King changed the world in many ways, not just the South, in terms of bringing about the change in the laws. He brought about some changes in attitude. He introduced to the world that you can stand up against the strong forces, but you've got to make sure that your motives are pure. You have to not really be fearful, and you have to stand up against that's unjust. Really considered one of the most important people in our lives.
Terrific. Ladies and gentlemen, Edwina Moss. To pick up today, some baseball cards.
Ah,
And I wondered if I could just this is sort of a name recognition, and if there's
Sure.
a vignette or something as you look at these names, that would be terrific.
yeah, Thurgood Marshall, whom I met when I was in 6th grade. And he was a young, skinny attorney pleading the case for the equalization of teacher salaries in Louisiana. Of course, Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy. Roy Wilkins, head of the NAACP, and one of those organizations that worked with us on everything. Jim Farmer, head of CORE, who really started the Freedom Rides. Ralph Abernathy, without whom we might not have had a Martin Luther King.
Right.
Ralph was a senior pastor to Martin. He gave in to Martin's leadership and agreed to be supportive of Martin's leadership in Montgomery. Otherwise, we would have had some of the traditional preacher fights and wrangles over leadership. Phillip Randolph is the father of the civil rights movement in many ways, was the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and went with Mary McLeod Bethune to see Franklin Roosevelt about desegregating factories during the war. Oh, yeah, I knew him as an older man. This is E.D. Nixon, who, with Ralph Abernathy, decided that Martin Luther King would be the better leader. And Whitney Young, who headed the Urban League and was professor of social work at Atlanta University, whom I knew most of my life. We used to call each other cousins. John Lewis, of course, who was a student when I was at the National Council of Churches. And when we saw John Lewis on television in Nashville, my wife and I decided we had to leave New York and the National Council of Churches and come back to the South. Yeah. But it was The Inspiration of John Lewis. This is James Meredith and John Doar going into the University of Mississippi. Brown versus the Board of Education. That's a little before my time. I was not active, but that might be Bill Coleman, who later became Secretary of Transportation.
Did your paths cross with his?
All the time, later on, but I didn't know him back then. Of course, Rosa Parks, who in many ways was the mother of the movement.
What kind of lady was she?
She was the quietest, sweetest, and most humble person you ever want to meet.
Right.
And she was more like Mother Teresa than, say, Winnie Mandela.
Right.
And of course, Julian Bond, who was one of our youngest heroes, and who has remained, in fact, we just endowed a chair at University of Virginia in his honor. Of course, that looks like the March on Washington, which I attended, and Septima Clark was the woman who developed the citizenship education program that I came back south to work with. I really came to work with Septima, but our offices, we were sharing offices in the SCLC building, and Martin started asking me to help him with his mail, and pretty soon, it took about 4 years, but I transitioned from the citizenship education program to SCLC. And this looks like Daisy Bates, who was one of the parent who led the fight for the Little Rock Nine. And Fanny Lou Hamer, whom I helped to recruit into the movement from Ruleville, Mississippi, and whom I went to get out of jail in 1963 when she had been jailed in Winona, Mississippi, and beaten for 3 or 4 days simply because she wouldn't say sir.
Right.
Fred Shuttlesworth is the father of the Birmingham movement. And I've never known a more courageously crazy man. He just did not believe in any kind of, to think about it and be rational about it was against his nature. If it's wrong, confront it, take it on, no matter what the price. Ruby Hurley was the secretary for the NAACP in the Southeast for the early 60s and late 50s. Of course, Medgar Evers, who was assassinated in Mississippi in 1963, but who was the field secretary for the NAACP throughout Mississippi. Actually, I went to work with Martin in 1961 in Septima Clark's program, but I was really an employee of the United Church of Christ. And I was sort of the administrator for the citizenship program, which Septima ran. But I ended up being pulled into training young people for the civil rights movement and assisting Martin in his mail and some of his correspondence.
But you happened to be in Memphis in '68 when he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. You were there principally, though, you were testifying at a hearing, weren't you?
Well, I was there testifying in behalf of we had been prevented from marching, and we went to federal court. And I had spent the day in federal court when Dr. King was prevented from marching, and we actually won the case. But as I came home and had been in court all day, we didn't have any cell phones in those days, so he hadn't heard from me all day long. And he started picking up pillows and throwing them at me, saying, "Where have you been? I haven't heard from you all day long. You have to keep me informed." And he started throwing pillows, and I started throwing them back, and it was It was, I mean, I'd never seen him quite so happy and frivolous. And 15 minutes later, he was gone.
The reason were you guys going to a reception? Was that the reason?
We were going to Billy Kyle's home for dinner.
When you heard the shot, did you think it was a shot, or?
No, I actually thought it was a car backfiring.
Really?
And I had no idea it was a shot. And then I looked up on the balcony and I saw that he was not on the balcony. And I actually thought he was clowning and had, you know, sort of gone back into the room. And then I saw his shoes sticking out under the balcony.
Did you get a sense, as far as, did they have an identification pretty immediately where the shots came from? And
we were pointing across the street to where the shots came from. Now, the shots could have come from, there were many people that said they saw shots coming from some azalea bushes that were about 6, 8 feet tall. And the FBI decided that it came from the window, the bathroom window. It really didn't make much difference to us then, but interestingly enough, when we came back from the hospital, the Memphis Parks Department was cutting down all those bushes and swept that whole area clean. So they were at least complicit to the extent that they destroyed the crime scene.
Right.
One Sunday morning I was in there, and Bobby, first thing Bobby said to me is, I meant to be on Meet the Press this morning. I'm just tied up with this Mississippi thing. Will you go on and do it for me? I'll tell them. So I did. And I came back and I had some work to do, and about 1 o'clock, 1:30, I went into his office and said, I'm going home now. Anything you want me to do? He said, you got anything important on this afternoon? I said, no. He said, would you mind going down to Mississippi and taking charge of the thing down there? He said, we don't have any senior official down there. And he said, I think if things go wrong, we'll be heavily criticized if we don't have somebody down there who's senior. And I can't go. He couldn't go. I mean, he would have started a riot just by being there. So I said, no, it's okay. I'll go. He said, I'll get a plane and take you. About then, my assistant, Harold Reese, stuck his head in the door. Bobby said, oh, Harold. He said, you got anything important on this afternoon? And Harold said, no. And Bobby said, well, how about you going with Nick down to Mississippi? So we did. We got a plane and went down there. And I don't know. I don't really know what we could have done. I've always thought it was a failure. But it was mostly, at least I like to blame it on the university more than I do on anything else. I mean, we were down there. It became obvious as the kids were coming back. We had Colonel Birdsong and the Highway Patrol was there. And it was obvious we had all these marshals with their helmets on and tear gas and so forth, and big armbands. And it was obvious that they were very annoying to the kids. And even early on, I asked the university, can we use the gymnasium so I can put away these 300 marshals or 400 marshals, whatever I had? The university said no. I had no place to put them. We were in the Athenaeum building, which was a sacred building to them in the Ole Miss, and by the Grove there. And it probably was the most irritating place we could have picked, but I didn't know any better. I didn't know anything about Ole Miss. I don't think anybody did. And then we had the developments, and Colonel Birdsong decided to pull out, and kids were throwing rocks and taunts and so forth and so on, and they got built up, and then they let the marshals use tear gas. It was getting pretty bad.
The situation in Oxford was becoming very tense as hundreds of people streamed into the area to defend Ole Miss and the Southern way of life.
We have had reports throughout not merely the students, but of all kinds of people pouring in cars in order to prevent Meredith from being admitted to Ole Miss. One has to remember also that that was the squirrel hunting season in Mississippi, so there were literally hundreds, thousands of guns. Every pickup truck had a couple of guns in it, so that the situation was really very dangerous.
The next day, Sunday, September 30th. Finally, President Kennedy decided the time had come to enroll James Meredith at Ole Miss.
And all the world are upon you and upon all of us.
The marshals were ordered not to use guns against the rioters, who were shooting and throwing Molotov cocktails. And the rioters were targeting the media, smashing cameras and attacking reporters.
So then we had the military come in. They had enough troops come in down there to Oxford, Mississippi, they could have kept right on going, taking Cuba.
Was there any moment of physical danger for yourself?
I suppose there must have been. I don't know. I wasn't particularly conscious of it. It was all kind of funny. I mean, we had a radio communication set up, which we had planned on in case there was problems to control the marshals. And the radio, the big radio, was set up in the basement of the courthouse. And then we had another set, which was set up in the Athenaeum building, smaller, and then we had walkie-talkies. So we had communication throughout the area. We used that to know what was going on. To get permission to use tear gas and so forth, I put a dime in a payphone. It was only a dime then. And called the White House collect and got the president and Bobby on the phone and maintained that throughout the whole time. It was quite funny, really.
As an open line?
Open line the whole time.
Payphone collect?
From payphone collect to the White House, yep. And so we knew what...
Story. Chairman of MCI talking about this.
We knew what was going on. They didn't.
Right.
And the Army didn't. And of course, this made a lot of problems in the Army. President Kennedy would say to the Army, "Where are the troops?" And the Army would say, "They're just now landing at Oxford, the airport there." And he would call me and say, "Are the troops there?" And I'd call the guy at the airport on the walkie-talkie. He'd say, "No troops around here." So we go back. The president was just furious at the Army, and it really wasn't their fault. They had no communications at all. And they had misunderstood some of the instructions badly. I don't know how, I don't know, but we had told them we didn't want loaded guns, because if they had to be used, we wanted to come in without loaded guns because of fear that we thought we could control the marshals, but we didn't know about the Army. But they had interpreted that as having no guns at all. So they were all standing around ready to go, but they had no guns, so they had to find guns for all the Army and so forth.
Deployment of federal troops was exactly what Kennedy had wanted to avoid. The next day, Governor Barnett called the White House with an alternate plan.
I'll tell you what I'll do, Mr. President. Yeah. I'll go up there myself.
Well, now, how long will it take you to get there?
And I'll get a microphone and tell them that you have agreed to be removed.
Now, wait a minute. Wait a minute, Governor. Now, how long is it going to take you to get up there?
About an hour.
Now, I tell you what, if you want to go up there, then you call me from up there, and then we'll decide what we're going to do before you make any speeches about it.
This man has just died.
Did he die?
Yes.
Which one? State police?
That's state police.
Yeah. Well, you see, we got to get order up there, and that's what we thought we were going to have.
President, please, why don't you, can't you give an order up there to remove Meredith?
How can I remove him, Governor, when there's a riot in the street, and he may step out of that building and something happened to him? I can't remove him under those conditions. Well, we've got to get somebody up there now to get order and stop the firing and the shooting. And then you and I'll talk about what's the best thing to do with Meredith.
While the president and the governor argued, the riot worsened. Finally, Katzenbach asked the White House for troops. It took hours for them to arrive, and during the night, 35 marshals were shot, and 2 people, a French journalist and an Oxford worker, were killed. But by dawn, the army had restored order.
Of course the president's going to win in the end. He's got the whole armed forces of the United States. He can call in the Air Force. He can bring Navy ships up the Mississippi River. He can call out the Army as he did. He can drop parachuters in. I suppose he could shoot missiles at Oxford, Mississippi. So he's going to win at the end.
And later, James Meredith came to my private office, and I accommodated the registration there.
It wasn't a cause for laughter and champagne, but it was a cause for some relief, and it was the fact that that was over with. I mean, in a way, Oxford had become the symbol of massive resistance and the final gasp of the Civil War, if you want to look at it that way. And it was over. It had ended.
It was a lonely victory for James Meredith, but it was a victory for him and the country. The Constitution had held and been reaffirmed in a major crisis. Thousands of black people felt the victory and saw James Meredith as an example to follow, a symbol, like the Little Rock Nine, of their own power. James Meredith tried again to register at the University of Mississippi, this time at its Jackson office, and this time accompanied by John Doar of the Justice Department and U.S. Marshal James McShane.
Funny thing happened there when we came down that hall that you saw the police coming down this narrow hallway, and I thought that we were going to go through a door at the end of the hall, but as we got, I was first, and then Meredith followed me, and then McShane, and when we got to the end of the hall, the door to which I thought we were going to enter was closed, and we were kind of moved sideways, and a door on the side of the hall opened, and there stood the Honorable Ross Barnett, and the television cameras came down over my shoulder, as I remember it, and before Barnett spoke, at length he looked at me, and then he looked at Meredith, and then he looked at McShane, and he said, "Which one of you is James Meredith?"
Thousands of black people felt the victory and saw James Meredith as an example to follow, a symbol, like the Little Rock Nine, of their own power to move the nation.
Well, obviously he was a courageous man. He had lots of nerve, and he was stubborn, persistent. He knew his own mind, and nobody was going to tell him what he should do or what he should not do. The segregation of blacks throughout the South and many places in the country would not have been solved with military. The strategy was focused on voting. And if ever we've seen a situation where the strategy is judged by the results, just look at what happened last week or on Tuesday. I mean, this is... Nobody in the world can believe that we did it. There hasn't been a country in the history of the world that has ever been able to as effectively solve a race or religious problem like this country has solved the race problem.
Referred to as the Gary Cooper of the Kennedy Civil Rights team. I know you're humble about all this stuff, but
you know newspaper people, when they get stuck, they make it up.
Well, here's one of those articles. As bottles, bricks, and stones began to crash around him, he urged the crowd to disperse, reminding them that Medgar Evers wouldn't want them to resort to violence. He asked for help in moving people along, and surprisingly, many listened and complied. I believe that had John Doar not done what he did, many people would have been killed, said Mr. Henderson. There would have been a riot of epic proportions. Goes on. It is impossible to imagine what direction the civil rights movement would have turned that day without Doar. A man trained for a courtroom, not to calm an angry crowd. That wasn't his job. He was only there because he was a friend of Evers and wanted to pay his respect. Doar told Charles Portis of the Los Angeles Times that he took his life in his own hands because, quote, it seemed the only thing to do. Portis went on in his article, said, quote, the Justice Department's John Doar, a 6'2", 41-year-old unflappable Irishman from Wisconsin, is becoming the Marshall Dillon of the troubled South.
And all I can say is, what are you going to do when what am I going to do when I hear this? It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Tell you about the students really were heroes. That Bob Moses, Diane Nash, Chuck McDew, John Lewis, they were really put themselves in really danger. And what Bob always says is that the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice gave them crawling space in Mississippi in 1961 through 1964. Just gave them crawling space. They had just a little room to move around. And they kept at it, and they kept at this voting, and urging people to go down to register. By 63, conducting mock elections because for governor and for the various federal officials that were up for office.
Monday, June 22nd, 1964, you get a call at your home in Chevy Chase, Maryland. On the line was Mary King, a staff worker in the Atlanta office of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. King told Doar alarming news. On the first day of the Freedom Summer, 3 civil rights workers were missing in east central Mississippi. King explained that Mickey Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Cheney had set out from Meridian on Sunday morning in a blue station wagon to investigate a church bombing in rural Neshoba County, a known high-risk area. When the 3 failed to return in the afternoon as scheduled, movement workers called local hospitals, jails, and law enforcement offices. The calls yield no word on the whereabouts of the civil rights worker. Could Doar help? King asked. What was your response when you got that call?
Well, we called the Bureau right away and asked them to conduct an investigation. There was no hesitancy about initiating an investigation, and it was that investigation that really changed the attitude and the effectiveness of the FBI. Before that, the FBI was not a very effective law enforcement agency in the South on civil rights matters. But after that tragedy occurred, President Johnson sent Allen Dulles down to Mississippi to make an investigation, and he came back, and among the things he recommended was that Mr. Hoover beef up the FBI capability in Mississippi, and Mr. Hoover did that.
Portions of your closing statement. I wonder if you would read those last 2 paragraphs, because at least for those who have been Jackson fans, you'll see the connection.
This is an important case. It's important to the government. It's important to the defendants, but most important, it's important to the state of Mississippi. What I say here, what the other lawyers say here today, what the court says about the law will be soon forgotten. But what you 12 people do here today will long be remembered. Then I went on to say, the defendants will stand before you on this record in the case, and they will beg of you of indulgence. In effect, they will say, as Gloucester said as he stood over the body of his slain king, say I slew him not. The king replied, then say they were not slain, but they are dead. If you find that these men are not guilty of this conspiracy, it would be as true to say that there was no nighttime release from jail by Cecil Price. There were no white knights. There were no young men dead. There was no murder. If you find that these men are not guilty, you will declare the law of Neshoba County to be the law of the state of Mississippi.
The proudest part of my career would be, how would you fill in that blank?
Proudest part was working in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, enforcing federal law with respect to free opportunity for all citizens to vote, free of discrimination.
Conclusion that Professor Neeson used when they honored you. And he concludes, I just think that you deserve a Nobel Peace Prize, John Doar. John Doar, a true American hero. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is Thurgood Marshall. I just read a book, I can't remember the title, about Thurgood Marshall's young years, about the years when he's finished law school, he's practicing law in Baltimore, he's not associated with the NAACP. So it's that period before he goes to the NAACP, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book because the author writes about Baltimore and what Baltimore meant to Thurgood Marshall. And Baltimore made Thurgood Marshall, created him. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. This is Marian Wright Edelman, who was a schoolmate of mine. That's to say, she went to Spelman College across the street, Morehouse College, where I went to school, and she and I were arrested together at the Atlanta City Hall. And it's great to see her. I have a great affection for her. This is Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy. This is the march from Selma to Montgomery. Abernathy is reading the newspaper, and King is looking over the side saying, why is he reading the newspaper when we should be paying attention to something serious? This is Roy Wilkins, who is an underappreciated man in the civil rights movement, thought to be more conservative than he actually was, thought to be more of a go-slow person than he actually was. But he's a noble figure and should get better attention than he does. This is James Farmer, who's in the same position, should get more attention than he did. And he knows he has a button in his lapel. I can't quite make out what kind of button. Oh, it looks like an Urban League button. You know, that three things. This is A. Phillip Randolph, the founder of the March on Washington, the great labor leader, wonderful, wonderful guy. Peculiar guy from Florida with an accent, sounds like he grew up in posh London, but a wonderful, wonderful man. And here's another single picture of Abernathy. Here's Whitney Young. Whitney Young was my neighbor. He and his family lived next door to my family when we lived in Atlanta in faculty housing. I had two daughters. I just saw one of his daughters in New York City. He was a great guy. It's E.D. Nixon. This is a younger E.D. Nixon than any picture I've ever seen. This is the man who got Mrs. Parks out of jail. That's what he's best known for. He's the great organizer, a labor union activist in Montgomery, a wonderful, wonderful guy. This is John Lewis, whom I know as the boy from Troy, chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, great, great friend of mine of many years standing. We have many, many great times together. He's about to be honored by a group in Washington. I have to make up some things to say about him for a video, which I've not done yet.
Wait, I think you mentioned something at the March on Washington, that Martin Luther King's speech was probably the most beautiful speech, but John Lewis's was the strongest.
It was the strongest speech. It was the most militant speech. And John is the only person speaking that day who said black people instead of Negroes or colored people. And my job, I had two jobs at the March on Washington. One of my jobs was to pass out copies of John's speech. And I tried to point out to the newspapers, look what he's saying here. Because I thought that would make us more militant than we really were, or at least more militant than we appeared to be. They didn't pay any attention, didn't make any difference. My other job was giving Coca-Colas to the movie stars. And I remember giving a Coke to Sammy Davis Jr., and he said, "Thanks, kid." This is James Meredith, Marshall, McShane, and John Katzenbach at Ole Miss delivering, I think they're delivering Meredith to the registrar's front door, and they're about to be turned away. Yes, Dorothy Counts. I was crazy about Dorothy Counts. I never met her. She's a real cutie. And this, of course, is Rosa Parks. You don't have to say much about her. A great book about Rosa Parks, written by my TA from Harvard, Jean Theo Harris. The newest book about Rosa Parks. Everybody should buy this book. It's a wonderful, wonderful book about the radical Rosa Parks. It gives you a side of Rosa Parks you know nothing about. I met Dr. King when he taught me. You know, a lot of people say I was a student of Dr. King's. Dr. King only taught one time, only taught one class, 8 people in the class. I'm one of the 8. So if somebody else says they were a student of Dr. King and they're not one of those 8, they're telling a lie. They're big liars. He taught a class at Morehouse College. He co-taught a class at Morehouse College with the man who had taught him philosophy at Morehouse College, Dr. Samuel Williams, who was president of the NAACP in Atlanta. And I was one of his students. And one day he and I were walking across the campus, and I said to him, "Doc," his friends called him Doc. I said, "How you doing?" He said, "Julian, I'm not doing well." He said, "Unemployment is high, racism is everywhere, segregation is immovable." He said, "I feel terrible, I have a nightmare." I said, "Doc, why don't you turn that around? I have a dream." And well, you heard it from me.
That's right.
I made that up.
But you know the good thing about oral history, will you say it one more time, it'll be.
This is Medgar Evers, the NAACP field secretary, the first NAACP field secretary who was shot and killed in Mississippi. This is a great picture from Birmingham of the protesters dancing in the wake of the hoses.
This time period, did that get really melded together when you were watching that on TV?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. It was. I think it did for the whole country. You know, President Kennedy saw this. He said, "This makes me sick." It just shows you the power of TV and how helpful, at least in this early stage of the movement, television was, how much television did to push the movement forward. This is Bayard Rustin, who is a great organizer of the March on Washington, a wonderful, wonderful guy. He's becoming more and more well-known than he is before. A book of his letters has just been printed and published, and it's great because he's a man of so many interests. Here. He's into this, he's into this, he's into this, he's into this. He's just a wonderful, wonderful guy. Charles Hamilton Houston, I believe. Yes, it is. The NAACP legal wizard, just a wonderful, wonderful guy. Died too soon, lost too early. Yes, Ella Baker, I was right. Ella Baker, who is just everything to the movement. SNCC's mentor, the mentor to all the people in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, just a wonderful, wonderful people. Helped Dr. King create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, helped him establish it, helped him get it going, and was wonderful with SNCC, helped us know which way to go. This is Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Huey Newton came to Atlanta once when he was head of the Panthers, and my brother and I were tasked with taking him around and showing him where to go. And I wanted so badly to impress him that I got a gun. It looked like a German Luger, but was just a .22. And my brother's driving the car, and I'm sitting over here, and Bobby Seale and his brother are sitting in the back, and the gun is on the seat between us. And I wanted, you know, Bobby to see the gun so he'd know how, and Huey to see the gun, they'd know what great fighters we were. Well, they didn't notice them, and so I began to pick the gun up and say, "Look over there, and look at this, look at this." He still didn't pay attention. This is Dr. Du Bois, who is the towering intellectual figure of the 20th century movement, just an incredible personality, wonderful, wonderful man. As I say, I've got a picture of myself with him, and it's just a treasure to have. And this is the wonderful SNCC Freedom Singers. Actually, it's the Freedom Singers, two of the Freedom Singers, Bernice Johnson and Cordell Reagan. They eventually marry, so she becomes Bernice Reagan. And then on the left-hand side, it's Bob Zellner, and the woman here is Dorothy Miller, who marries Bob Zellner and becomes Dorothy Zellner. And this is not Adolph Rollins, but Avon Rollins from Knoxville, Tennessee. And they're singing. And Cordell had this beautiful, beautiful voice. I always wanted Cordell to sing at my funeral, and the sad story is I had to sing at his. But he was just a wonderful, wonderful singer. This is Bob Moses, the leader of the Mississippi movement for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, just a wonderful, wonderful guy. You know, he used to talk, when he'd talk like this, and pretty soon you'd notice everybody in the SNCC was doing this. Every single person was doing this. And this is me. This is a terrible picture of me. But I think this is, I'm not really sure where it is. I'd like it to say, let me see. I had something I wanted to put on my headstone, and I can't think of it. Oh no, easily amused. That's what I want, easily amused. I want race man and easily amused. That's what I want on my headstone.
He was a minister in Birmingham, Alabama. He was courageous in a way that few people appreciate. Dr. King was actually very reluctant to come to Birmingham in 1963. Dr. King was very ambivalent about the ethics of using children as part of the Children's Crusade. And as you recall, the power of the Birmingham movement was that civil rights leaders said, we're going to get these young kids out of school and let them lead the march. And they couldn't tell their parents. They didn't tell the teachers. In contemporary context, you could see it as a pretty edgy way to make change. But Reverend Shuttlesworth was absolutely persuaded that this is what needed to happen. And he believed in the gospel, but he believed in the kind of gospel that required you to stand when other people are sitting and to speak when other people are quiet. And I really, really respect that. He's a sitting U.S. Supreme Court justice. That's what we understand about him. But he was also a brilliant tactician, a brilliant strategist. He kept more cases from the U.S. Supreme Court than he took to the U.S. Supreme Court. And as a lawyer, you'll appreciate the significance of that. He always had a sense about when it was time to push the court to make a decision. And you have to be really careful about that, because if you push them before they're ready and they make the wrong decision, then you've created precedent that may block reform for a generation. And so I really respect how brilliant and strategic he was. We had many opportunities to take cases to the court. In the years leading up to that, we chose not to. We had basically a 5-year strategy to get young offenders who we thought would make compelling narratives around the set of issues that we thought were important. No, we were very determined to find a path to the court that maximized the chance of relief, because we knew that the odds were against us. And the same was true for Justice Marshall. You know, Brown and these cases had all kinds of precedent leading up to them that said you will not win. And so you have to maximize your chance of success. That was certainly what we were trying to do in Miller and Jackson and all the juvenile cases. Yeah. Now, this image of Dr. King leading a march is not an image that you see frequently. You see him at the March on Washington. You see him in different settings where he's giving speeches. We have a calendar, civil rights, kind of a racial history calendar. And what we're trying to do with our calendar is actually give images that change this narrative, that get people to think not about the glory of the civil rights movement, not about the success, not about how transformational it is, but we want people to reflect on the pain, the anguish, the suffering, the humiliation about it. My favorite Ralph Abernathy story is that he was giving the warm-up speech for Dr. King in Mississippi at some place. He said, you know, when the civil rights movement prevails, we're going to have people calling us Mr. Jones and Ms. Smith and Miss Wilson and Ms. Clark and Mr. Clark, and they're going to call us Mr. and Ms. and Ms. and everything's going to change. And then he said, and maybe after we get freedom and after we get civil rights, we won't call them Mr. We'll call them by their first names. In fact, he said, when we get civil rights and we win this struggle, it's not even going to be Mississippi anymore, it's just going to be Sippy. And I love that story. She wanted to be a force. She wanted to attack segregation everywhere she saw it. And so it wasn't the first time she got arrested. She got arrested many more times after that. And I think she felt that that was her calling, you know, her challenge. And she thought it was important that people who weren't ministers, who didn't have doctorate degrees, be forceful leaders in the civil rights movement, because everybody said all the time, this is a movement for everybody, not just the preachers, not just the kind of the elites, if you will. And I think she very much recognized that. E.D. Nixon is from my town, Montgomery. Mr. Nixon, again, a fantastic organizer. The Montgomery bus boycott would not have succeeded without E.D. Nixon. He's the one who developed the resources necessary to organize transportation and get people from point A to point B. I love this story about how they were about to give up the boycott when this older woman stood up and said, "Don't y'all stop nothing for me." And she said, yes, I've got to get up and I've got to walk 3 miles in the morning, and yes, I work 10 and 12 hours, and yes, I've got to walk 3 miles back home at night. She said, but I'm not going to stop, and you all can stop, and if you stop, I'll keep walking all by myself. And just when she thought the church was prepared to give up, she got up there and she said, you know, I've got to keep walking because I believe I'm going to sit in the front of a bus in Montgomery. And then she said, my feet are tired, but my soul is rested. And there is something about that spirit, which you see in the lives of people like E.D. Nixon and all of those great architects of the Montgomery bus boycott. It was the fearless, in many ways, he was the person that everybody talked about. He was doing the work in Mississippi, fearless, just would go to any place and be a witness. He said, basically, we have to show people that strength will prevail, that courage will prevail. And even when it doesn't in that moment, we have to keep making that witness. He embraced nonviolence with the kind of radicalism that even put many others in the civil rights movement to shame. Charles Hamilton Houston was in many ways the architect of the modern legal movement around civil rights. Houston was the dean of Howard Law School, which is where most people of color went to law school. And he would tell these black law graduates at Howard, when they graduated, he would get up and he would give a speech and he would say, because you are graduating from law school, you will be one of two things. He said, you'll either be a social engineer or you'll be a parasite. And you have to choose what you're going to be. He said, but because you have knowledge, because you have skills, because you can help people, you have to commit to engineering a society where we help more people. And if you don't do that, you're going to be drawing the blood from the community of people that gave you the space that you have in this law school. And I've always valued that orientation. I like Mr. Meredith because he's also dealing with what I'm dealing with, which is the, you know, this sort of simplification of the civil rights movement. I'm very troubled by the way we are celebrating some of these 50th anniversary things. I don't like the way we've simplified it. We've made it sort of celebratory without talking about the challenges. You know, I get frustrated. You hear some people talk about the 50th anniversary, and it's almost as if, you know, the civil rights movement was this 3-day experience where first day Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat. The next day, Dr. King led a march on Washington, and the third day, Congress signed all these laws. And isn't it wonderful that in 3 days we created a different America? And if you think about it like that, you're going to get frustrated that people are still talking about race and bias and exclusion. I think for me, what I think about my work, when we started representing condemned people, you know, I think that if there have been 4 institutions that have shaped the lives of people of color in this country, I'd say it's slavery, terrorism between Reconstruction and World War II, apartheid in the civil rights era. And I think the 4th would be mass incarceration. The way in which we have used jails and prisons to stigmatize, to oppressed, to create hopelessness in communities of color. And so for me, that's been the great institutional challenge that I've tried to take on. And so my work would be, my card would talk a lot about the work we're trying to do to reduce mass incarceration, to try to end the kind of race consciousness that has created so many unreliable outcomes. And there was an older man in the church. This older man was in a wheelchair, and he was staring at me pretty intensely all during my presentation. I mean, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I was taken aback, so I just looked at him, and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I really didn't know what to say. And then he smiled just a little bit, and he said, "I'll tell you what you're doing." And then he said, "You're beating the drum for justice." And I never will forget it. He says, "You're beating the drum for justice." And then he pulled me to him, and he said, "Come here, come here, come here." He said, "You see this scar I have on my ear?" He said, "I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama, in 1964, trying to register people to vote." He said, "You see this scar I have right here? I got that scar in Philadelphia, Mississippi, trying to register people to vote in 1963. He said, "You see this spot over here? That's a bruise I got in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963. And then he said, "People think that these are my cuts and my bruises and my scars." And he put his hands on his head. He says, "These aren't cuts, bruises, and scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." And if I ever get a card, I'd be honored if just somebody said he tried to beat the drum for justice. That's all I'm looking for. And that's all we can do. But I'm really, really privileged to be doing the work that I'm doing in the place that I do it.